Thank you very much, and very much appreciate the warm welcome. I just wanted, for those of you who don't know anything about Tasmania, just very quickly, population 512,000, a land mass of about 90,000 kilometres, 25% of it is water, so we have had less of a water shortage issue than possibly other states. A little bit of background on TasWater. I'm not going to read all that out and bore you. What I would like to just say though is that I think is of relevance to New Zealand is it's a very dispersed asset base. If you look up there, 110 sewage treatment plants for a population of 500,000 people. It's just quite extraordinary. It is responsible for all of the water and sewage infrastructure in the state, and it acts as the retailer, the asset manager, responsible for all of the maintenance, renewals, and being the sole provider for water and sewage, I have to say it is very public. We are regularly in the newspaper, not always positively, and regularly having to explain to the public why they actually need to pay for water and sewage, and they did actually pay for it in the past, they just didn't know they were paying for it. And everyone in Tasmania, I can assure you, as I'm sure is the case in New Zealand, has a view on water and sewage, and they're certainly prepared to express it, particularly to me at barbecues. Just very briefly, a little bit of reform history. So pre-2009, there were 29 councils responsible for local water and sewerage and 3 bulk water authorities. In 2009, we moved to 3 regional water authorities and a common service provider. And 2012, we consolidated the common service provider with some activities to move them into the regional corporations, but it still existed to some degree, the common service provider. And in 1 July last year, we formed a single Tasmanian water and sewage business. I suppose my one message, and I preface this with, if it had been possible, I think moving straight to the end game would have been enormously beneficial. Having 4 corporations on the way through was probably the only way to politically make it work. I wasn't there at the time. I was involved in electricity, as you probably heard. But I think for the people it's been pretty traumatic coming out of the councils, then through the regional authorities and then into a larger authority, every time experiencing another sense of change and concern about their jobs and will I be doing something different. Personally, I think, if possible, in New Zealand, get to your end game. Whether it's 1 or 4, go straight there if you can. I think it would be fair to say that the 4 former corporations achieved much and under very difficult circumstances. They inherited a legacy from the councils of underinvestment. And not because councils necessarily wanted to underinvest, it's just a factor of the size, the balance sheet of small regional councils. Often they can't invest in appropriate technology. Sometimes, I'm not saying it happened, but it's possible that some of them might have taken the money that should have been or could have been allocated to water and sewage and sent it elsewhere to try and balance their budget. All of these things added up to a crisis in Tasmania, which in effect led to this one corporation. That crisis being, it was clear that at least $1 billion had to be spent in a short period of time to fix the state's water and sewage infrastructure. So we're now 5 years in. We've got 26 towns still on boil water notices and do not consume notices. So it's a relatively small proportion of the population, 1.5%, but a big deal if you're one of the people living in that town, and a big deal if you're the water and sewage authority responsible for people's health, I can assure you, because I'm not convinced people boil the water, quite frankly. Still, 60% of our sewage treatment plants are not compliant. And I'd say a large proportion of those have what I would call non-contemporary licences. So in reality, the number is much worse than that. Our sewer and water breaks, chokes, bursts are all well above national benchmarks, and there are too many spills from our sewer pump stations. A lot of them don't have telemetry, don't have SCADA. When they spill, nobody knows until it runs down onto the beach and we get a phone call. And they're not very pleasant to receive, I might add. And combining multiple cultures into one, you might think, well, what's culture got to do with water and sewage reform? It's right at the top of the list. It's about people's attitudes, about how they work, whether they're committed to the reform. Without the right culture, you will spin your wheels. And we're at the moment in the midst of building our own culture, which is not a council culture. I'm not being derogatory to that, but it's a different culture needed for council infrastructure. It's a water and sewage culture, which I'll talk a little bit about shortly. Oops, I've hit the wrong button. So I want to talk a little bit about why one business, and I say the potential benefits, because it's one thing to be able to identify the benefits, it's another to actually deliver them. So I think if you start with financial capacity to address public health and environmental legacy issues, the first thing you note was when we went from, as I said, from 29 councils to 4, you did get a significant increased capacity to start dealing with issues. But even as 4 corporations quickly found that there were still constraints. So our northwest region inherited too much debt, therefore didn't have the balance sheet to support the improvement in infrastructure. So they were severely constrained on the way through. I think there's also, and I wrote financial capacity because that's the obvious one that everyone sort of gets, but there's also, I think, a broader opportunity you have, which is the capacity to deal to the really tough choices. When you're a bigger corporation, you've got people with skills from across the nation and nationally, and you've got a bit of clout, you can actually take on the tough stuff that's really unpopular. And let me give you a few examples of some of the things that I'd almost have called intractable for the last 4 years, that we've just got into. We're dealing with this first year. If we don't make real reform in the first year, we don't deal to the tough issues, we'll never deal to them. So the first thing we went after was trade waste. I don't know how many of you have experienced with trade waste, but nearly all of our sewage treatment plants are domestic. They're designed for domestic waste. So every time a major manufacturer drops a load of yogurt or something like that down the drain, they kill all the bugs, our sewage treatment plants die. We then have 6 weeks of phone calls from angry customers, unhappy about the smell from the local sewage treatment plant. And you can imagine, to fix it, trade waste customers have got to start sending compliant trade waste. They've got to invest in their plants, right, and start paying an appropriate fee. Not a very happy bunch initially, but we got on and did with it. Biosolids, I heard a little earlier about sludge. Sludge is a major issue everywhere. Grasping the nettle and saying we are going to invest in biosolids programs, stop taking it to tip, which we've started to do. Service replacement, this is what that is. We have in our state, it said of those 26 towns that don't have that are on boil water and do not consume notices, a large portion of them, it is not economically viable to continue to provide treated water. Tough message. So on average, some of them would cost $50,000 to $60,000 a property in towns that are dying, or no tourist route, no schools. No, what do? You've only got so much money to go around. You've got to make some tough choices and bring them along with you. And this is one of the things we've finally said, we've just got to bite the bullet here, have a policy, communicate with these people, give them fair and reasonable options. Service introduction, another one. Service introduction is, what about all those towns that don't currently have water and sewage services? Do you provide water and sewage services to them? If so, who's going to pay? Where's the money coming from? On what terms? Again, we've had to introduce a policy so we can move forward because, again, there's a limited bucket of money. And lastly, you have the opportunity, and this is the one that excites me, to deal with generational infrastructure issues. We have long-standing infrastructure that is nearing the end of its life. We either invest heavily in those 100+ sewage treatment plants and try and bring them up to standard, or we say, no, now is the decision point. It's time to clean up our rivers. It will be far more cost effective to invest in a single treatment plant in that region and do away with 6, 7, 8 treatment plants in the north or south. But we need $1 billion for it. So you've got to have a business plan, you've got to be able to prove it, that it works, you've got to test it, and then you've probably got to have a 10-year view on that. If we don't make the decision soon, the decision will be made for us. We'll be out there spending a hell of a lot of money on plants that should have been shut down years ago. And we'll probably never reach the public health standards we should. I think the next one for me is, in terms of benefits, is a bigger business does attract high calibre employees. We had 600+ applicants for our 8 general manager positions. We attracted people from all across the country and indeed across the globe because they're excited about the opportunity for the transformation. The cost savings in the first 2 years, so the year leading in and this year, that have arisen from forming one corporation out of the 4, will see $70 million in savings over the next 10 years. That's min. We've already captured a bit more than that, but I've sort of rounded it out at 70. And why does that matter? Because that 70 million is 70 million that doesn't have to be recovered from customers to fix the infrastructure. There's the capacity to build professional services for customers. I'd say for us, do we satisfy customers? No. We service them, we answer the phone within 80% of our calls in 30 seconds, but they often have to ring 3 times to get their problem solved. When you've got scale, you can start putting in professional systems, give customers real service. And lastly, and I think I could have put this at the front, and I tossed up whether to put this at the front. This is the other thing that really excites me about reform in the water industry in Tasmania. You have a choice. Right? You have a choice about how you want to reform your industry. And for us at TasWater, our board and the senior management team, we're about making positive economic outcomes. It's not just about delivering water and sewage. It's about how do we make a positive difference for our state and all the local communities. That means we're removing all the cross subsidies, removing anomalies. We're looking for ways to increase investment in the state. So we've changed our approach to headworks, done away, if we've got spare capacity, why are we charging extra to customers? We actually need to encourage them to develop in areas where we have that capacity. Our capital investment program is a major boost to the state, which is in the order of $100 million per year going forward. Our pricing and planning policy, so you've got an opportunity here when you're a bigger business, say how much do we really need? Don't draw out any more than you need. Work out what your long-term plan is, and we've actually, you'll see in a minute, substantially reduced prices as from next year in some regions. And lastly, there's an opportunity, if you really believe in your state, to work with other utilities. I sit back, because I come out of the electricity industry, and I come into the planning and water industry, and I say to myself, why are we not all at the same table? Surely there must be extraordinary benefits from making sure that electricity infrastructure is aligned with road infrastructure, is aligned with water and sewage infrastructure. Why isn't that happening? And this is one of the things we're already starting to advance. I'm now, I suppose one thing before I go on to what matters for government, I'd like to talk a little bit about what it takes, in my view, and it's just my view, to really deliver these things. All of those benefits, they're not given. In fact, they're really hard yards. You're not going to be welcome regularly when you make these changes. And it requires a very clear vision of what it looks like at the end. Just like any great project manager, you better have a good idea of what the goal is. It requires commitment through the tough times, and particularly by the key stakeholders, and I'm going to come to that. Strong leadership and alignment across the sector. If you don't get alignment across the sector, there'll be so many blockers, you'll be forever trying to unblock everything to move forward. And a passion for customer and community focus. You've got to believe in your community. Strong communication skills and knowing when to compromise. I think over my career that's been a real art, learning just when to compromise and when not to. So what really matters for government? So in our case, and I know this is quite contextual, but I'll talk a little bit about our case, they have to be prepared to champion the change, often in the face of public criticism, and they will be criticised. You can absolutely guarantee it because there's always an opposition, someone who has to point out a point of difference. And the extent to which people are paid for water and sewage will be a key contributor. In our state, people's water and sewage bills were largely incorporated into their rates bill and based on their annual assessed value. So everyone had a different, in effect, everyone had a different pricing regime. 250,000 different pricing regimes, depending on the size of your house and the value of your land. Not a good starting point. I think governments need to accept that reform on the inside takes a hell of a lot longer than on the outside. Just because you've developed the legislation doesn't mean the job's done. Good legislation, clear objectives, and appropriate levels of oversight. We have 5 regulators. An environmental regulator, an economic regulator, a Department of Health and Human Services, the water regulator, a dam regulator and a fire services regulator. But reality is in my experience, we all work pretty well together. We know where the boundaries are, we know what we're trying to achieve. A long-term commitment. It can't be driven by political cycles. If you're only looking at it as a government for the next cycle, don't waste your time. Honestly, you'll just send everyone in circles. And comprehensive planning and research. Need to anticipate the issues and use people who actually have experience. Just avoids repeating mistakes. Now for owners and councils. And I know this won't be overly popular, but I've had a bit of experience of not being so popular with councils. They must have skin in the game. This has been our experience. So in Tasmania, as I said, our 29 councils are our owners, and it's actually really helpful. The majority of us now, we work well together, we meet on a quarterly basis, but they do not have direct control. We have an independent, skills-based board that's appointed by a select group of the owners. And that really matters, I can assure you. As a CEO, it matters enormously. If you want real reform, you've got to have people with skills, without any parochialism. The reality of local government is they are very local community focused, and it's often very difficult for them to move away and accept that sometimes investment has to go somewhere else. They must recognise and accept the need for different cultures in the water and sewage business. The council culture in Tasmania is quite different to what's needed for a water and sewage business. The water and sewage business, we're talking about generations. That's a view you've got to have. In my experience in Tasmania, a lot of the councils, because they had little money, very challenging circumstances, all about what's the next band-aid we're going to put on to keep us afloat, keep things going. Spread of owners and shareholders aids good decision-making. Separate returns from votes. So this is one of the things that's worked extraordinarily well. Each council only gets 1 vote. So when you draw up your shareholders' letter of expectation and your objectives, the constitution, you get 1 vote. However, your returns are based on the proportion or the value of the assets you invested. Now that obviously creates the potential for a little bit of game playing on the way in, but the value it creates is enormous, and it reduces block outcomes, where blocks in regions try to dominate and produce outcomes that are not best for the state, they're just best for their region. If you really want it to work, publicly support decisions once they're made if you're an owner, and keep your debates in-house. Have them robust. We have very robust discussions, but we work hard to make sure we keep them in-house. And commitment to staying the course. If you're going to go down this journey, as a council, you better be prepared to wear some bad publicity and outcomes that might be suboptimal initially for your particular council. If you can't think about the whole, again, my advice would be don't start, or start it with lower expectations. I'm not saying this happened, of course, but I would suggest you avoid, if you're a council, avoid using the formation to transfer out your problem employees and any of the debt you think, oh, here's an opportunity. It's possible that some councils could have said, well, actually, we need to unload a bit of debt here. Now, there might be an opportunity. What if we transferred that to the water and sewerage business? Not helpful when you're trying to build a balance sheet. You're only reducing the probability of success. And lastly, be transparent with the public and your counterparts. Fairness with the public and other councils assists better long-term outcomes. If you're an owner and you can only think about your council, you're probably underdoing the potential benefits. For the corporation, what really matters? It's actually about trust and confidence. Be realistic about what can be delivered, ensure your promises are met, and communicate the positives. You must do that to the community. You must get out there and communicate and fess up when you stuff up, because you will as a corporation, and we have. But I like to think we've done a lot more good than bad. Except that all your decisions won't be great, but you have to move forward anyhow, and often you won't have the data you need. And every now and then it'll be apparent that you need to change course, and be prepared to do that. Being fixed in your attitudes, and I'm an engineer, I love calculations and formulas and algorithms, but the reality is life is much more complex. New information comes in all the time. Hard skills are important, but soft skills are absolutely essential. So here I'm a project manager, as you've probably heard, and an engineer. So all the hard stuff about, bringing in new operating models, restructuring the business. We did a complete restructure from top to bottom, writing all the PDs, creating the vision, all those tangible, what I'd call hard skills. I actually find that the easy part of the journey, and that's what you do up front. The real success is determined by the soft skills. And that's your ability to get out and engage. The chairman and I met with every council this year. We have to educate them. We have to share our thinking. We have to be prepared to be challenged. We have to build relationships. And, put here, communicate. You just can't communicate enough. People will move on very quickly. And scale counts. I think there is a point at which scale counts negatively, but for us, scale makes an enormous difference. You can get great people, and it's not about offering the best salary, but you must have a plan, and you must be prepared to adapt. So I think I'm about right on time, if I've got that right. So just a quick summary. No magic formula. There isn't a magic formula for change. I've been doing it for probably 20 years, but certainly in an executive position in the last 10. But there's plenty of evidence in terms of what are the key ingredients that I spoke about earlier. Must have soft skills. I know of businesses and water corporations that have been formed that met all their KPIs but still got turned over, undone, back to council, because they didn't recognise it was actually about the soft skills. Government must be prepared to champion the cause and commit to the long term. Councils have to have skin in the game. We give them distributions. There's been a lot of controversy over that, but the benefit of it is they generally support us, they're interested, and you need them in that space. But they have to be prepared to devolve control if you want real change and real transformation. They have to act as shareholders, not directors and management. And the corporation must earn trust and respect, and that's our key theme. Trust, respect, we're an essential services provider. How do we build that? Right? How do we make a positive difference for our community? So we do that by keeping our promises, communicating extensively, and being prepared to adapt. And my last little piece of advice, if possible, as I started, move to the end game as quickly as you can. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have any questions for Mike? One down here.
You mentioned that Tasmania sounded like a bit of a crisis point before the reform. Did reform require that crisis?
Yes, I'd say yes. I mean, you know, most of us who have backgrounds in change, any change journey requires dissatisfaction. If there's no dissatisfaction, generally there's no support for the change. Governments, and we heard from the earlier speaker, Carleen, who remind us of how great an opportunity crisis is to make real change. And it's so true.
One last question.
Have you got any tricks for getting over the self-interest when you're joining separate entities together? Wins and losses in the mix there.
I don't know about tricks, but I've seen them all now. I think have someone in the room with experience that's seen them all. Be prepared to negotiate. Be open and honest with people and get them all in the same room. And then get the government to stand behind your position, because they'll go out then, and just like every negotiation. Every time it gets watered down, and you know, I appreciate your question, because this is the reality. Every one of those compromise decisions weakens the potential benefit of the reform. So they're the easy things to do, is to compromise on some of that stuff, but the price will be paid in the next 10 or 20 years.
Mike, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
And on behalf of Water New Zealand, it's great.
Thank you.
Enjoy catching up with you later.